David Cameron has survived the phone call from hell, the call he had to make yesterday to Jean-Claude Juncker, congratulating the Luxembourger on becoming President of the European Commission. An outcome Mr Cameron, of course, believed was bad for us and for Europe generally. An outcome he fought against to the end, faced flushed with anger, we are told, as he forced that vote on Friday that he knew would end in defeat. So what now? Mr Cameron himself, writing in the Telegraph this morning, says the task of renegotiating Britain's relationship with Europe has got harder and the stakes have got higher, but it can still be done. Already, he says, there has been real change in Europe and there can be more. In a moment, we will hear from the prominent Tory Eurosceptic, David Davis. First, though, let's turn to Lord Mandelson, former Labour Cabinet Minister and European Commissioner, who's in our radio car. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How depressed are you by this outcome?
I'm not depressed by the outcome of Mr Juncker's appointment. I don't think he is an ideal candidate, but he is the Commission President we now have. I saw him last Tuesday. I was in Berlin at a conference, as he was, and we did a question and answer panel. I was struck by three things. First of all, he explicitly said that he does not advocate a United States of Europe. He's not a sort of green-eyed sort of federalist monster, as some in Britain have portrayed him. Secondly, he strongly agreed with me when I said that were Britain to leave the European Union, it wouldn't just be a catastrophe for Britain, it would be a disaster for the European Union as a whole. And the third thing I was struck by was his emphasis on the economy in Europe and the need to drive up our competitiveness and our share in global markets. Now, and that would mean, he accepted, extending and deepening Europe's single market. So these are encouraging signs about his policy agenda, and we've now got to set about working with him in them.
Very interesting. So you have met him face to face recently after he's had all this bruising stuff about him, particularly in the British press, and your view is, having talked to him in public and in private presumably, is that he is now willing to do business with Mr Cameron.
Yes, he is, and I did talk to him for half an hour in private. Look, Mr Juncker has both the experience and the knowledge to be an effective president of the European Commission. But equally, the reservations about him were that the European Union has reached a stage when it needs to be sort of challenged a bit more, not in its fundamental role and purpose, but in its priorities and also the way in which it does its job. And there was a feeling that Mr Juncker, being such an old hand in Brussels, would not be the person to challenge the Union in the way that it needs to do.
But would you go so far as to say that now that he can, that he will provide that challenge?
I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt, and I think that the Prime Minister was right to call him yesterday on the telephone, and we should now set about working closely with him. But I would just give this advice to our Prime Minister. Stop waving around this sort of threat of a referendum in Britain as if it's some sort of pistol that we're holding to everyone's head and saying, you've got to agree with us, or else. Secondly, he's got to formulate a Europe-wide agenda, an agenda that's right for Europe as a whole, and doesn't keep giving the impression that the only reason that he, Mr Cameron, is advocating these measures is because of divisions in his own party. The third thing I think is really, really important. He's got to get more effective Brits in senior positions in the Commission and elsewhere in Brussels. Every other member state is pressing the case of their individuals. We need to do the same for our own, and we have to make a very important start, of course, in nominating an absolutely first-rate commissioner, British commissioner in Brussels, because that person will bear a great deal of responsibility for pursuing the right agenda. I'm not going to preempt the Prime Minister's prerogative to nominate his own commissioner, but it really does have to be somebody who has real intelligence and effectiveness, who's committed to the European Union and isn't just simply going to Brussels to sort of carry on, some sort of Tory party war against Europe.
The point is, and listening to what you've just said, that this fight, this ongoing, perhaps fight is too strong a word, this struggle that we have with other European countries, these discussions, they go on. And progress, as the Prime Minister suggests today in The Telegraph, I think you're saying, could still be made. So when Ed Miliband says David Cameron is toxic, as if this fight about Juncker was itself something that destroys British influence in the European Union, that's not quite right, is it?
Well, the problem is that the Prime Minister, in the way that he's gone about handling Britain's interests in Europe, has rather isolated himself. He makes it more difficult for people to back him, even when they agree with the points that he's making. I mean, he does find it very difficult now to get others in the European Union to follow him on anything, and that, I'm afraid, is as a direct result of the way in which he has conducted his case in Brussels.
Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, thank you very much for talking to us. David Davis, as I was saying, former Shadow Home Secretary, Conservative MP, is here. Good morning.
Good morning.
What Mr Cameron's suggesting in The Telegraph this morning, in the article that he's written, is, and he says it in terms, anyone in Europe who thought I was going to back down or blink is now thinking again. In other words, this was a good fight to have, and it has left him stronger.
Well, he had no choice but to resist Juncker. Juncker was a very poor candidate, I'm afraid, is now the Commission president. But he's a very, very strong federalist, always has been, creator of the euro, architect of the euro, really, and indeed midwife of the euro in terms of the difficult times post-2008. So he was a bad candidate. There weren't, bluntly, any non-federalist candidates. I mean, they're all the same in that respect. But David Cameron, Prime Minister, had to resist him. Whether the tactics were right, well, frankly, that's yesterday's war. But
quite apart from the tactics, the fact of him having had this argument on Friday, and an argument, by all accounts, and we talked to the Latvian Prime Minister over the weekend, who had been pretty shocked, actually, by what had gone on in that building, and the reports of it over the weekend, that actually that was the right thing to do, and has had the result of making his position stronger in Europe in achieving, eventually, the goals that he wants to achieve. Is that true, do you think?
I actually think it's been probably, in the longer run, less important on both sides. There are those who said this has made it harder, those who said make it easier. I don't think either is true. The simple problem we have is the direction of Europe is one which does not suit Britain, does not suit our democratic history, our judicial history, indeed our economic history. And we need them not just to talk about subsidiarity, their favourite phrase. We need them to do something about it. They've been mouthing these words for 40 years, bluntly, and they have not delivered with it the actual repatriation of powers, the rights to opt out, all the things that we actually need. And it's now beginning to have serious impacts on British people's lives. I mean, you saw the row over immigration that dominated the EU, the European Parliament elections. We're going to see more and more of that.
So when Mr Cameron says in The Telegraph, it's there for the first time, the concerns of the United Kingdom will need to be addressed. It's there in black and white in the European Council's conclusions, signed by all the heads of government on Friday. That means what to you? Well,
the words are often there, I'm afraid. It's not the first time. I mean, there are many times that European leaders have said we need to pay attention to the specific needs of the UK. It's about the delivery, and this is the problem. I mean, we'll know in a couple of years' time. We won't know now, but we'll know in a couple of years' time whether we're going to get the things we need.
When he writes that, has he been hoodwinked, or is he playing for time?
No, I mean he's doing what all prime ministers do quite properly. They make the best position they can of what they've had, and he's had a very, very difficult few weeks, to say the least. But what he has to do is turn this into, in this respect, Lord Mandelson's right. He has to turn it into a tactical advantage in the next year or two. It's going to be very difficult. I mean, Lord Lawson, who knows his way around these corridors as well as most people, has taken the view that there's going to be nothing material come out of a negotiation. I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's where the odds are. It's going to be very, very difficult to deliver an outcome which will allow British people to vote stay in.
What do you think the bottom line is of what has to be delivered?
Oh, well, there are a series of bottom lines. I mean, some relate to free movement of peoples, some relate to, the huge burden of regulation that sits on British industry now actually handicaps our ability to fight in the world markets. But also, frankly, we need some constitutional changes to allow us in the future, if something actually challenges our national interest, to do something about it, say, no, up with this, we will not put. And that's going to be the hardest thing to deliver. A constitutional change which protects the nation state, really difficult to deliver, but actually necessary.
And it will mean a change in the EU treaties,
I think
which is, of course, the really difficult thing.
I think it has to. That's why it's got to be 28-0. That's why we have to persuade everybody. And again, in that respect, Mandelson's right. We have to persuade everybody. But one of the levers, and in this, the Prime Minister's demonstrated actually quite well in the Juncker battle, one of the levers is that people don't want us to leave. I mean, that is real. That is real. The Germans don't want us to leave. We support their free market approach. Others don't want us to leave because we are a counterweight to the sort of the Franco-German axis and so on. So that is actually powerful. And whether Mandelson likes it or not, it is an important card to be played, and it's beginning to be played today.
Final, very brief one about what's happening within the Conservative Party. Reports over the weekend that there is an assurance now from ministers that when it comes to a referendum, if the referendum happens in 2017, that Conservative MPs will be given the ability to campaign on both sides. Is that your understanding at the moment?
Oh, yeah. And in any event, it's a given. I mean, this is such an important issue. You could not apply a party.
And ministers as well, do you think?
I think once the negotiation is done, I think ministers should too. That's what Harold Wilson did in 74, 75.
But you haven't had that assurance yet?
No, that assurance hasn't come. But I think it's almost automatic.
David Davis, thank you very much.
Thank you.